out of here!
Move out, quickly! Keep the pace up! Come on, men, push! We must get this tank free!
It's too deep, Sergeant. We can't move it.
Adjust target bearing to 090.
090 confirmed, Comrade Sergeant.
Load the gun.
The tank is hit! Get out! Move! Move! Medic! We need a medic over here!
January 17th, 1942. The frozen plains outside Moscow stretch endlessly under a pale winter sun. Frost clings to every branch, every hull of the German Panzer tanks as they crawl through the icy mud. Engines grind and exhaust steam curls into the bitter air. German crews, confident in their armor and training, scan the horizon for Soviet defenders. But today, something feels different. A distant whine slices through the cold wind. At first, it is faint, almost indistinguishable from the groan of the tanks. Then the shadows above resolve into tiny, low-flying aircraft, moving with unnerving precision. The tankers tighten their grips on their controls, hearts quickening. Moments later, shells explode around them, not randomly, but with uncanny accuracy. Each impact a deadly whisper. Someone above is guiding these shells. From their periscopes, the men see the invisible hand coordinating the destruction. Smoke rises from comrades' tanks as artillery hammers positions they thought were safe. Confusion ripples through the German lines. How could the enemy know exactly where to strike? In these first harrowing minutes, the Eastern Front reveals a new terror. The sky itself has become a weapon. This was the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one where airplanes were no longer just scouts or bombers, but the unseen eyes directing the artillery that would shake the Wehrmacht to its core. The German tankers had never faced anything like this before. Winter 1941. The Wehrmacht, flush from rapid victories across Western Europe, now faced a vastly different challenge on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had aimed to crush the Soviet Union with the speed and shock of blitzkrieg. Panzer divisions, spearheading deep thrusts, had overrun border defenses with frightening efficiency, leaving entire Soviet units encircled and shattered. Yet, as autumn faded into winter, the relentless advance slowed. The Russian winter was no mere inconvenience. It was a weapon. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Snow turned roads into treacherous traps, immobilizing tanks and artillery alike. Fuel froze, engines seized, and men suffered frostbite even before the first bullet flew. The German high command, accustomed to mobile warfare, faced a dilemma. Armored units required open terrain to exploit their speed, yet the vast plains around Moscow offered little cover, and Soviet defenses were increasingly sophisticated. German tanks, formidable in their design, relied heavily on coordination with artillery to soften enemy positions before an assault. But in 1941, that coordination had limits. Artillery officers often operated from static positions, using outdated maps or intermittent radio signals. The result was predictably brutal. Shells fell short or overshot, and German tankers advanced into zones that were far from softened. Without precise observation, even experienced commanders could not accurately anticipate Soviet defensive fire. Meanwhile, the Soviets were learning. Every failed German push taught them more about the vulnerability of tanks to combined arms attacks. Soviet artillery units, though initially rigid in their deployment, began experimenting with a new approach: observation from the air. Light reconnaissance planes, once used mainly for scouting enemy positions, could spot German columns moving across the frozen plains. Observers radioed coordinates directly back to artillery batteries, adjusting fire in real time. This method, still in its infancy, was quietly transforming the battlefield. By late 1941, German Panzer units noticed subtle changes in the battlefield pattern. Shells began landing with unusual accuracy. Positions thought secure were suddenly pummeled. Yet, the full scale of Soviet innovation remained invisible from the tank interior. Crews attributed the precision to luck or the enemy's hidden artillery observers, unaware that the skies themselves were now active participants in the war. The stage was set for a collision between technology and tradition, between the German reliance on armored mobility and the Soviet commitment to observation, adaptation, and attrition. It was a war where winter, terrain, and innovation intersected in ways that would forever alter armored combat. As the tankers pressed forward, unaware of the looming threat, the Soviets prepared to unveil a method that would redefine the meaning of artillery fire. By the end of 1941, the Red Army faced a desperate struggle to defend Moscow. Soviet forces had been battered by the initial German onslaught, yet their resilience was remarkable. Amidst the chaos, Soviet commanders sought ways to offset the Wehrmacht's superior mobility and armor. One solution emerged from a simple yet revolutionary idea: to use the skies as an extension of the artillery command post. Observation aircraft, small and maneuverable, had long been employed for reconnaissance, mapping enemy movements and reporting true positions. Planes such as the P-2 biplane and the Su-2 light bomber, traditionally relegated to minor roles, were now repurposed. Equipped with radios, observers could relay precise coordinates directly to artillery batteries in real time. Unlike conventional methods, which relied on static observation posts or delayed reports, this approach allowed shells to strike moving targets with unprecedented accuracy. The first attempts were cautious. Soviet pilots flew low, often below enemy anti-aircraft coverage, circling over German columns to report coordinates. Initial successes were modest. A few tanks damaged here, a supply convoy disrupted there. Yet even these small victories sowed confusion among German crews. The psychological impact was as potent as the physical damage. Panzer commanders began noticing that no matter how quickly they moved or maneuvered, artillery seemed always one step ahead, arriving exactly where it was needed. By early 1942, the technique had matured. Coordination protocols were refined. Observers signaled adjustments in hundreds of meters. Artillery units calibrated shell trajectories, and liaison officers ensured that every battery understood its target priority. IL-2 ground attack aircraft, famed for their armored hulls and heavy cannons, supplemented these operations. Though primarily designed for direct strikes, IL-2s could act as spotters, marking enemy concentrations for the heavier artillery units to annihilate. German Panzer crews, however, remained unaware of the full extent of these innovations. To them, it appeared as though the battlefield itself had become sentient, with shells striking impossibly precise locations, often before commanders could respond. A tank column moving through the snow could be shredded within minutes, not by a frontal assault, but by a coordinated dance between air and artillery. The sheer accuracy was shocking. Tanks that survived one strike were often obliterated moments later as aircraft hovered overhead, feeding the enemy's position to the waiting guns. This combination of low-flying observation aircraft, real-time radio communication, and disciplined artillery batteries marked a profound shift in warfare. For the first time, the Soviets had transformed what was once a static, predictable artillery system into a dynamic, almost surgical instrument of destruction. Every German advance now risked exposure not just to ground defenses, but to an unseen hand directing lethal fire from above. The shock this innovation inflicted on the German armored forces would ripple across the Eastern Front. Panzer commanders, accustomed to dominating the battlefield with speed and coordination, were forced into a reactive posture, scrambling to survive attacks they could neither predict nor fully understand. The stage was now set for multiple angles of this confrontation to unfold: human, technological, tactical, and strategic, each revealing a different layer of this evolving battlefield. Inside a Panzer IV, frost-coated fingers gripped the controls, eyes scanning the horizon through periscopes. The crew is alert, trained, disciplined, but nothing could have prepared them for this. Shells fall with alarming precision, each explosion rattling metal, splintering ice, and shaking the very earth beneath their tracks. For the men inside, the war they understood, one of armored duels and infantry engagements, had shifted. The sky had become an invisible enemy. Tank commanders spoke in terse commands, trying to maintain cohesion as fear gnawed at their nerves. Radio chatter crackled with confusion. Fire is too accurate. Impossible coordinates. Mechanized crews whispered rumors of Soviet sorcery or secret weapons, disbelief mingling with terror. Some panzermen, hardened by months of combat, admitted later in reports that the sensation of being hunted from above was unlike anything on previous fronts. It was not just the loss of equipment. It was the loss of control, the realization that their usual tactics were insufficient against this unseen force. From a Soviet perspective, the innovation was deceptively simple. Small reconnaissance aircraft, outfitted with radios and navigational instruments, became force multipliers for artillery. The P-2 biplane, slow and fragile by design, exploited its low visibility and agility to shadow German movements. Observers marked tank columns, tracked their speed, and relayed coordinates with meticulous precision. The artillery, no longer blind, could correct every salvo in real time. For the German armored forces, this technology was terrifying. Tanks were armored against anti-tank guns, prepared for mines, but entirely vulnerable to accurate indirect fire guided by eyes in the sky. Even the Panzer III and IV, robust and lethal in ground engagements, could do nothing to escape the invisible hand directing shells from miles away. In reports after battles near Moscow, German officers admitted that even minor movements exposed them to artillery strikes that seemed almost supernatural. Tactically, the effect was transformative. German formations relied on speed and coordinated attacks to exploit weak points. Columns moved in predictable patterns, roads and frozen plains dictating their paths. Soviet planners understood these limitations and capitalized on them. With aircraft relaying positions to batteries, artillery could blanket the approach routes with devastating efficiency. Encounters quickly demonstrated a painful truth. Traditional blitzkrieg tactics, effective across Poland and France, faltered under this new paradigm. A tank commander's calculation of distance and cover no longer guaranteed survival. Routes considered safe became death traps. Units that had advanced unopposed the previous year were now decimated before reaching their objectives. German doctrine emphasized concentrated force, but air-directed artillery shredded cohesion, forcing tanks into dispersal or retreat. The combination of fear, technology, and tactical disruption created a perfect storm. Human anxiety amplified the effect of Soviet innovation. Technology magnified the lethality of artillery. and tactics that had once ensured German dominance became liabilities. Panzer crews had to adapt, improvising under fire, but the learning curve was steep and casualties mounted quickly. German commanders, from company officers to Panzer division generals, faced an unprecedented dilemma. Their operational doctrine relied on coordination, momentum, and concentrated armored thrusts. Yet the sudden appearance of air-directed artillery forced rapid reconsideration. Orders that once guaranteed the destruction of Soviet positions now risked annihilation of their own forces. Field reports from early 1942 reveal intense debates among officers. Some argued for dispersal and erratic movement, attempting to break the enemy's targeting solution. Others advocated night maneuvers, hoping darkness would reduce observation. High Command issued cautious directives. Tanks were to advance with infantry support and avoid exposed terrain, but the measures were often too late or inconsistently applied. Leadership under these conditions demanded not just tactical skill, but psychological resilience, maintaining morale while witnessing the death of comrades to an invisible, omnipresent enemy. From a Soviet side, the innovation was both practical and symbolic. Commanders recognized the weaknesses in German armored doctrine and exploited them systematically. Observers in the air were not simply reporting targets. They were shaping the battlefield. Batteries fired with precision, and each successful strike reinforced the morale of Soviet troops on the ground. Pilots and artillerymen understood that their cooperation magnified the effect of individual actions. One observer in a platoon could guide dozens of shells onto advancing tanks, turning a few shots into strategic disruption. These early successes validated Soviet doctrine and provided momentum for further innovation. As commanders noted the impact, coordination between air and artillery became standard practice. By the winter of 1942, what had been an experimental tactic evolved into a reliable instrument of war, one that could dictate the pace of armored operations and instill uncertainty in even the most experienced German units. The human dimension of this encounter cannot be overstated. For German tankers, the battlefield no longer resembled the familiar contests of armor versus armor. Each shell, arriving with uncanny accuracy, introduced a sense of helplessness. Veterans recalled that fear became almost tactile, gripping the hands and minds of crews, affecting reaction time, coordination, and decision-making. This psychological pressure had strategic consequences. Panzer units began to hesitate. Formations lost cohesion, and aggressive tactics gave way to cautious advances. Morale, once a driving force behind rapid advances, eroded as soldiers grappled with the realization that the battlefield itself could betray them. Conversely, Soviet troops drew confidence from these innovations. Artillery officers knew that air observers could see the results of each adjustment, and every German tank destroyed validated months of planning and ingenuity. By the end of this phase, the battlefield had transformed. What had been a contest of brute force and maneuver became a chessboard in 3 dimensions: air, land, and artillery, all coordinated to devastating effect. German tankers were forced to confront not only superior numbers in certain sectors, but the reality that their usual assumptions about armor, terrain, and artillery had been rendered obsolete. The combined pressure of leadership challenges, enemy innovation, and psychological strain set the stage for a dramatic climax. In the next phase, the full impact of air-directed artillery would be realized in decisive encounters that reshaped the course of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. December 5, 1941. The outskirts of Moscow are a frozen, desolate expanse. German panzer divisions, exhausted from months of continuous advance, grind forward across snow-laden roads. The 7th Panzer Division, under General Erhard Rouse, presses towards Soviet positions near Volokholamsk. Temperatures have plunged below minus 20 degrees Celsius. Ice crunches under the tracks, and the bitter wind pierces every layer of uniform. Suddenly, a low hum cuts through the sound of diesel engines. A small formation of P-2 reconnaissance planes appears over the horizon, weaving silently above the advancing columns. Observers aboard these fragile biplanes are calm, scanning the frozen landscape, calculating range, and bearing for artillery batteries hidden miles behind the lines. Their radios crackle to life, sending coordinates to waiting Soviet guns. The first salvo lands almost immediately. The shells do not scatter randomly. They strike precisely between the lead tanks and their supporting infantry, catching the German formation in a deadly crossfire. Tankers scramble, trying to maneuver through the snow, but the artillery keeps adjusting. Every attempted change in speed or direction is anticipated. Reports from surviving crewmen describe the surreal accuracy as if the shells are drawn by an invisible hand, anticipating every move. Within 30 minutes, multiple tanks are immobilized. Smoke and fire rise from burning engines, tracks twisted and broken. The column falters. German officers attempt to reorganize, but communication lines are disrupted by shrapnel and frost-damaged radios. Field reports later recorded that this was one of the first occasions where a panzer column suffered sustained losses directly attributed to coordinated air observation artillery. Soviet observers continue circling above, adjusting the fire with precision. Batteries, previously limited to static bombardment, now strike moving targets with efficiency previously thought impossible. Even veteran crews, hardened by months of combat, cannot comprehend the sudden lethality. General Rouse later remarked in his notes that the attack shattered not only the tanks, but the confidence of the men inside them. This engagement demonstrates the turning point of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. The Germans realized, often too late, that their tanks were no longer supreme on the battlefield. Mobility, armor, and tactical doctrine, once the pillars of blitzkrieg, were now vulnerable to a combination of Soviet ingenuity, coordinated observation, and artillery precision. By the end of the day, the battlefield had been irrevocably altered. The psychological toll on German tankers was as significant as the material losses. Units that survived the initial barrage moved cautiously, hesitant to advance in an open terrain, aware that any misstep could be fatal. Soviet command, confident in the effectiveness of air-directed artillery, pressed the advantage, using these engagements to refine protocols, improve timing, and coordinate subsequent attacks. This first decisive clash near Moscow would serve as a model for future operations, revealing the deadly synergy of planes and artillery. Yet, the full magnitude of the innovation, its impact on broader German strategy, was only beginning to unfold. January 12, 1942. The snow-laden approaches to Volokholamsk had become a deadly trap. German panzer units, still reeling from earlier encounters with air-directed artillery, advanced cautiously, hoping to secure supply lines and push Soviet forces back. The 10th Panzer Division, alongside infantry and supporting armor, moves in narrow columns along frozen roads, aware that any open ground could be lethal. Above them, a fleet of Soviet observation planes, P-2s and the occasional Su-2, sweep across the battlefield. Observers in the cockpits coordinate directly with artillery batteries positioned behind ridges and forests. Shells begin to land with almost preternatural accuracy. Lead tanks are disabled in seconds, engines splintered, crews trapped inside metal husks. Following vehicles attempt evasive maneuvers, but the artillery continuously recalculates, guided by real-time updates from the sky. Reports from survivors describe chaos and panic. Tanks, previously confident in their speed and armor, are rendered immobile in minutes. Some units attempt to disperse into surrounding forests, only to find themselves funneled back into kill zones by the terrain and meticulously plotted artillery fire. German officers struggle to adapt, issuing contradictory orders under extreme stress. By mid-afternoon, over 30 tanks have been destroyed or disabled along a single kilometer of advance. The operational impact is profound. German armored doctrine, built on rapid concentration of force, aggressive breakthroughs, and coordinated support, crumbles under the relentless accuracy of combined air artillery attacks. Commanders now face a stark choice: halt the advance entirely, disperse units and risk isolation, or attempt night movements with minimal visibility. Each option carries heavy risk, as Soviet observers adapt tactics to counter German improvisation. In parallel, Soviet forces refine their procedures. Air crews communicate with multiple batteries simultaneously, alternating targets to maximize disruption. Artillery observers note velocity, armor type, and even likely escape routes, predicting German maneuvers with increasing precision. For the first time on the Eastern Front, a tactical innovation allows one side to dictate the tempo of armored warfare without engaging in direct tank combat. By late January, these engagements forced German command to rethink operational planning. The myth of invincible Panzer columns is shattered. Field reports describe a new kind of vulnerability. No matter how well trained, how armored, or how disciplined, a tank unit could be neutralized by the lethal combination of air observation and artillery. Soviet successes in these months set a precedent for subsequent winter operations, demonstrating that coordination, adaptability, and technological ingenuity could overcome even the most formidable mechanized forces. The climax of these encounters is not measured solely in destroyed tanks. It lies in the psychological shock inflicted upon German tankers and commanders alike, a realization that traditional blitzkrieg was not infallible, that speed and armor were insufficient without countering the unseen eyes in the sky. This awareness, combined with material losses, would reshape German armored strategy for the remainder of the campaign. From the chaos and destruction of these winter battles, the consequences became clear. Armored warfare had entered a new era, one where mobility and firepower alone could not guarantee survival. The aftermath, both immediate and long-term, would reveal the full scope of this transformation. January 20th, 1942. The snowfields around Volokholamsk are littered with the remains of German panzer columns. Twisted steel, blackened tracks, and scorched earth mark the path of the once feared 7th and 10th Panzer Divisions. Survivors stumble through deep snow, frostbitten and exhausted, many haunted by the realization that the battlefield had changed irrevocably. Casualties are high. Reports estimate that over 60 tanks were destroyed or rendered inoperable in a series of engagements, with hundreds of crewmen killed, wounded, or captured. The psychological toll on German forces is immediate and profound. Tankers report feeling hunted, vulnerable not by enemy armor, but by artillery strikes coordinated with precision from above. Confidence in traditional blitzkrieg tactics erodes rapidly. Unit cohesion suffers as commanders struggled to maintain order under unprecedented stress. Even seasoned veterans, hardened by campaigns in Poland and France, described the sensation as surreal, shells striking positions previously thought secure, movement and concealment rendered almost meaningless. German officers attempt to adapt. Reports from the front emphasize the need for dispersed formations, nocturnal maneuvers, and increased reconnaissance. Yet these measures provide only partial relief. Supply lines are disrupted as trucks and convoys are destroyed along predictable routes. Infantry supporting the armored units suffers alongside the tanks, facing relentless indirect fire with little capacity to respond effectively. Morale declines, and hesitation replaces the boldness that had previously defined German armored tactics. On the Soviet side, the success of air-directed artillery reinforces both confidence and doctrine. Observers are praised for their accuracy, artillery units for their responsiveness, and pilots for their courage flying low over enemy positions. The integration of planes and guns is now a proven strategy, validating months of experimentation and adaptation. Soviet command begins to formalize procedures, establishing standardized communication protocols and refining target prioritization. The immediate aftermath also highlights a shift in operational dynamics. German units, once the aggressors dictating tempo, are now forced into defensive or reactive postures. Offensive plans are delayed or canceled, and commanders must balance the risk of losses against the necessity of advancement. The once predictable rhythm of armored offensives gives way to uncertainty, hesitation, and constant recalibration. Even beyond the tactical and operational consequences, the engagements around Volokholamsk signal a deeper strategic shift. The battlefield has expanded vertically. Dominance now requires control not only of the ground, but of the air and the communication channels that link observation to fire. Those who fail to adapt risk not only defeat, but annihilation. These immediate losses and disruptions set the stage for a longer-term transformation in both German and Soviet approaches to armored warfare. The winter of 1941-42 would be remembered not only for the bitter cold and frozen mud, but for the emergence of a new, deadly synergy between aircraft and artillery. By spring 1942, the lessons of the winter battles near Moscow and Volokholamsk had crystallized. German high command acknowledged that their armored units were vulnerable in ways previously unimagined. Reports emphasized that even well-armored tanks, moving with discipline and speed, could be neutralized by artillery guided from above. The shock of these encounters forced doctrinal revisions. Panzer divisions began incorporating dispersed formations, increased reconnaissance, and a cautious approach to open terrain. Yet these adjustments came at a cost. Speed and concentration, hallmarks of blitzkrieg, were sacrificed, reducing the operational tempo that had defined German successes in 1940-41. Technologically, the Wehrmacht attempted to adapt. Flak guns were repositioned to protect key routes. Radios were upgraded to allow faster response to observed threats, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance was increasingly tasked with countering Soviet observation aircraft. These measures mitigated some risks, but the fundamental problem remained. German armor had to contend with a new battlefield dimension, one in which unseen observers could direct destructive fire with uncanny precision. For the Soviets, air-directed artillery became a cornerstone of operational doctrine. Artillery units trained extensively with observation planes, integrating low-level reconnaissance into standard practice. IL-2 ground attack aircraft, initially designed for direct assaults, were deployed in support of this system, marking enemy concentrations and disrupting armored formations. The success of these tactics reinforced the Soviet commitment to combined arms innovation, demonstrating that strategic ingenuity could offset numerical or technological disadvantages in armor. Beyond doctrine and technology, psychological impact endured. German tank crews, conditioned to dominate the battlefield through speed and armor, now faced a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Morale in many units remained fragile. Hesitation and caution became common, slowing advances and providing the Soviets with precious time to fortify defenses and plan counteroffensives. The repeated shock of precise artillery fire instilled a cautious, almost defensive mindset, influencing German operational culture well into 1942. Strategically, these encounters reshaped the Eastern Front. German planners had to factor in the ever-present threat from air-directed artillery, complicating offensive operations across the winter and spring campaigns. Conversely, Soviet forces gained confidence and initiative. The ability to inflict significant losses on the enemy without engaging in direct tank combat allowed them to conserve forces while exacting heavy damage. This asymmetric advantage proved decisive in subsequent battles, highlighting the interplay of innovation, coordination, and adaptation in modern warfare. By the end of the Winter Campaign, the Eastern Front had become a laboratory for a new kind of combat. German tankers and commanders had learned the hard way that armored supremacy was no longer guaranteed. The success of air-directed artillery foreshadowed the increasing complexity of modern warfare, a system in which mobility, firepower, and coordination across domains determined survival, not brute force alone. The battlefield had changed. The lessons were stark, and the consequences would ripple through the campaigns to come. The events of the winter of 1941 to 42 revealed a profound truth about modern warfare. Domination on the ground is never absolute when the sky itself can shape the battle. German tankers, trained to rely on speed, armor, and coordinated maneuvers, discovered that innovation and adaptability could overcome even the most formidable machines. Air-directed artillery did more than destroy tanks. It reshaped thinking, forcing commanders to reconsider assumptions that had once seemed immutable. For the Soviets, the integration of aircraft and artillery demonstrated the power of ingenuity under pressure. A simple observation plane, combined with disciplined coordination, could become an instrument of destruction far greater than its size or armament suggested. This synergy between technology and strategy became a hallmark of Soviet doctrine, influencing operations for the remainder of the war and laying the groundwork for combined arms tactics in future conflicts. The human dimension is equally striking. German crews endured fear, uncertainty, and disorientation as they confronted a threat they could neither see nor fully anticipate. Soviet pilots and artillerymen, in turn, faced extreme risk flying low over enemy columns, their courage multiplied by precision and purpose. In this interplay, innovation met experience, and strategy intersected with human will. Ultimately, the legacy of air-directed artillery is a lesson in adaptation. It demonstrates that even the most powerful machines and the most confident commanders can be humbled by creativity, coordination, and the ability to see the battlefield in 3 dimensions. The winter battles near Moscow were not only a crucible for armored warfare, they were a turning point in military thought, where observation and communication proved as lethal as firepower, and where the sky itself became a weapon. In the quiet aftermath, the frozen plains remembered the fire and the fear, the smoke and the shattered tanks. And in that silence, a new chapter of warfare had been written, one in which survival depended not merely on strength, but on vision, ingenuity, and the courage to embrace change.